loneliest people don't always cry for help. Sometimes they fall asleep when no one thinks to look. At 2:07 a.m., the hospital chapel sat almost empty beneath a ceiling of dark wooden beams and colored glass. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the city, turning the lights of Manhattan into blurred streaks of gold and silver. Most of St. Gabriel Medical Center never truly slept. Monitors continued to beep, elevators continued to rise and fall. Nurses hurried through corridors carrying charts and coffee cups. But here, inside the small chapel tucked away near the east wing, time seemed slower. Elena Bennett sat alone in the third row. Her pale blue scrubs were wrinkled from a 16-hour shift. A half-finished cup of coffee rested beside her. She had come intending to stay for only 5 minutes, just long enough to close her eyes, just long enough to breathe. Instead, exhaustion won, her head tilted against the wooden bench. Her hands remained folded loosely in her lap, and sometime after midnight she drifted into sleep beneath the colored glow of the stained glass window above the altar. The chapel remained silent except for the distant hum of the hospital ventilation system. Then the door opened. The sound was soft, almost careful. A tall man stepped inside, bringing with him the faint scent of rain and cold night air. He paused just inside the doorway. His dark overcoat was still damp from the weather. Drops of water slid from the fabric onto the stone floor. For several seconds he didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the sleeping woman near the front. Sebastian Moretti had not intended to come here tonight. In truth, he never intended to come here at all. Yet somehow, over the last 6 months, his feet kept bringing him back to this room, back to the quiet, back to the silence that seemed safer than the rest of the world. The city knew his name. Business owners lowered their voices when he entered a room. Politicians returned his calls. Reporters speculated about him endlessly, but none of that mattered here. Inside the chapel, titles disappeared, power disappeared. Even grief seemed to soften around the edges. Sebastian slowly removed his gloves and slipped them into his coat pocket. The stained glass window painted streaks of blue and red across the floor as he walked forward. His footsteps remained almost soundless. Elena never stirred. Her breathing was slow and steady. A loose strand of blonde hair rested against her cheek. The hospital badge hanging from her pocket swayed slightly whenever she shifted in her sleep. Sebastian's eyes lowered to the badge. Elena Bennett. He recognized the name, not because they had met, they hadn't. But he had seen her moving through the halls before, usually carrying equipment, usually moving too quickly, usually looking like someone trying to hold together a life that never stopped demanding more from her. Tonight she looked different. Smaller somehow, human, tired in a way that couldn't be fixed by sleep alone. Sebastian stood there longer than he should have. The chapel was large enough for him to sit anywhere else. There were dozens of empty benches, yet he remained where he was, studying the sleeping woman illuminated by colored light. Somewhere far above them, thunder rolled softly through the clouds. Elena shifted slightly, but didn't wake. Her hand slipped from her lap. The coffee cup beside her tipped dangerously near the edge of the bench. Sebastian reached forward instinctively and steadied it before it could fall. The movement was small, meaningless perhaps, yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself lingering. Finally, he sat down, not beside her, not yet, one row behind. Far enough to respect the distance between strangers, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of her breathing. Minutes passed, then more. The rain continued outside. Somewhere in another part of the hospital, a code alarm sounded briefly before fading away. Life continued, but inside the chapel neither of them moved. One sleeping, one watching the colored light crawl slowly across the floor. What Elena Bennett didn't know was that this wasn't the first night Sebastian Moretti had come searching for silence. And what Sebastian Moretti didn't realize was that this exhausted woman sleeping beneath stained glass was about to change a part of his life he believed had been buried forever. Then, just before 3 a.m., Elena stirred. Her eyes began to open, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. Elena's eyes opened slowly, struggling against the weight of exhaustion. For a moment she forgot where she was. The colored light from the stained glass window painted faint shades of blue across the chapel floor, and the distant hum of the hospital seemed far away. Then she noticed someone sitting behind her. Every muscle in her body tensed. She straightened immediately and turned around. The man sitting one row back looked calm, almost motionless. Dark hair, dark coat, the kind of posture that suggested confidence without effort. He was looking toward the altar rather than at her. "Sorry," Elena said quickly, brushing loose hair from her face. "I did not mean to fall asleep in here." The man glanced toward her. His expression remained unreadable. "You looked like you needed it." His voice was low and steady. Elena looked away first. Most people in the hospital either rushed through conversations or avoided them entirely during night shifts. Something about this exchange felt different. Slower, the chapel suddenly seemed smaller. She grabbed her coffee cup and realized it was closer to her than she remembered leaving it. A faint crease appeared between her brows. Had she moved it? She could not remember. "Do you work here?" she asked. The man shook his head. No. That answer only created more questions. Visitors rarely wandered into the chapel at nearly 3 in the morning. Elena studied him for a second longer. His clothes looked expensive, not flashy, just tailored in a way that suggested money without trying to prove it. Before she could ask anything else, her pager vibrated against her hip. The shrill sound broke the moment instantly. She checked the screen and sighed. Respiratory consult. 4th floor. "Duty calls," she muttered. "Get some rest when you can." Elena almost laughed at that. Rest felt like a luxury people talked about but never actually experienced. She stood and slung her bag over her shoulder. For a second she hesitated. "Good night." "Good night, Elena." She froze. Her name. He had used her name naturally, as though he had known it for years. Her hospital badge suddenly felt much more visible, hanging from her pocket. Of course, he must have seen it while she slept. Still, something about hearing her name in his voice lingered longer than it should have. Elena pushed the thought aside and left the chapel. The next 48 hours blurred together. Patients, reports. Endless hallways filled with fluorescent lights and coffee that tasted burned before it ever reached the cup. St. Gabriel Medical Center seemed determined to test the limits of human exhaustion. By Thursday night, Elena felt like she was moving through water. Every step required effort. Every conversation felt half a second slower than normal. Shortly after midnight, she found herself standing outside the chapel again. The realization surprised her. She had not planned to come here. Her feet had simply carried her down the familiar corridor. The room beyond the wooden doors glowed softly with candlelight. She stepped inside, empty. At least that was what she thought initially. Then she noticed a paper cup resting on the bench where she had slept 2 nights earlier. Steam still rose from the lid. Elena stopped. The coffee had not been there when she entered. She looked around the room. No one. Her eyes drifted back to the cup. Written across the side in black marker were 2 simple words. For Elena, her heartbeat quickened slightly. She picked it up. Warm, fresh. Whoever left it had done so recently. She crossed to the doorway and looked into the hallway. Empty. The elevator doors at the far end closed quietly. That was all. Elena returned to the bench and sat down. The scent of coffee filled the air. For reasons she could not explain, a small smile appeared on her face. Across the street from the hospital, a black sedan sat parked beneath a row of rain-darkened trees. From inside the vehicle, Sebastian Moretti watched the chapel window glowing softly against the night. He never saw her smile. He only saw her sit down and wrap both hands around the coffee cup. Something in his chest loosened slightly. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one he had not experienced in a very long time. He started the engine. The car eased away from the curb and disappeared into the sleeping city. Inside the chapel, Elena stared down at the cup resting in her hands. She should have ignored it. She should have forgotten the stranger entirely. Unfortunately for her, she was already wondering whether he would come back. By Friday morning, Elena had convinced herself that the coffee meant nothing. Hospitals were full of kind strangers. Visitors brought flowers. Volunteers left snacks for exhausted staff. Someone had probably noticed her falling asleep in the chapel and decided to do something thoughtful. That explanation made sense. It was simple, safe. Unfortunately, every time she repeated it to herself, she remembered the handwriting on the cup. For Elena, not for whoever happened to sit there. Not for the tired nurse in blue scrubs. For Elena. 3 nights later, her shift finally ended just after 4 in the morning. The city outside was wrapped in fog drifting off the Hudson River, turning the streets beyond the hospital windows into pale shadows. Elena stepped into the cafeteria hoping to find something stronger than the stale coffee available on her floor. The cafeteria was nearly empty. A janitor pushed a mop across the far corner. A resident slept with his head resting on a table covered in patient charts. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Elena ordered coffee and turned toward the seating area. That was when she saw him. He sat alone near the windows overlooking the parking garage. A black coat hung over the back of his chair. One hand rested around a ceramic coffee mug. The other held an old photograph. Elisana slowed without realizing it. For a second she considered turning around. Instead, curiosity won. She carried her cup across the room. The man noticed her approach, almost as if he had expected her to appear. "You again," Elena said. His eyes lifted briefly. "You sound disappointed. I sound suspicious." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. Close enough to count, Elena sat across from him before she could change her mind. Outside the window, rain slid down the glass in long silver lines. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Eventually, Elena nodded toward the photograph resting near his hand. "Family?" Something shifted in his expression. Not pain exactly, something quieter, older. He glanced down at the picture before turning it face down on the table. Something like that. Elena instantly regretted asking. "Sorry," remained calm. Most people stop asking questions once they realize they might get real answers. Elena looked down at her coffee. Occupational hazard. Medical people ask questions for a living. Almost never. That earned a genuine smile. Small, brief, but real. For the first time, he looked less like a stranger and more like an actual person. The silence returned. This time, Elena noticed details she had missed before. A faint scar near his jawline, dark circles beneath his eyes, the look of someone who had not slept properly in a very long time. Whatever his life was, it clearly extended far beyond late-night visits to hospital chapels. "You never told me your name," she said. The man studied her for a second. "Sebastian? For now." Elena laughed softly despite herself. "That sounds suspiciously dramatic. Maybe it is." Somewhere overhead, an announcement echoed through the cafeteria speakers. Another patient transport request. Another reminder that the hospital never stopped moving. Elena glanced toward the clock. Nearly 5 in the morning. Dawn was beginning to lighten the edge of the sky beyond the parking garage. When she looked back, not intensely, not uncomfortably, simply paying attention in a way few people ever seemed to. "You should go home," he said. Elena almost choked on her coffee. That is rich coming from someone sitting in a hospital cafeteria before sunrise. "I am not the one falling asleep in chapels." She opened her mouth to argue and then closed it again. "Fair point." Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. He scribbled something on it and slid it across the table. Elena unfolded it. A phone number, just 10 digits. Her heartbeat skipped slightly. "What is this, a favor? I did not ask for one." "No." Sebastian stood and picked up his coat. "But one day you might." Elena looked from the number back to him. Before she could ask another question, he was already walking away. His figure disappeared through the cafeteria doors and into the quiet hospital corridor beyond. She stared after him for several seconds. Then her eyes dropped to the photograph he had forgotten on the table. Her breath caught. A young woman stood smiling beside a lake beneath bright summer sunlight. Blonde hair, gentle eyes, familiar features. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The woman in the photograph looked startlingly like Elena, and for the first time since meeting Sebastian, she wondered whether their encounters had ever been accidental at all. Some questions refuse to stay buried once they find a place inside your mind. For the rest of that morning, Elena carried the photograph with her thoughts even after she left it exactly where she had found it. She never touched it, never picked it up, yet the image followed her through every hallway and patient room. The resemblance had been impossible to ignore. The woman in the picture could have been a relative, a cousin, a sister. By the time her shift finally ended, exhaustion mixed with curiosity until neither feeling could be separated from the other. Outside, a cold spring rain drifted over Manhattan. Elena pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward the employee parking garage. The concrete structure rose 6 stories above the street, grey and silent beneath the cloudy sky. She was halfway to her car when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the far end of the garage. Sebastian, he was alone beside a black sedan, one hand in his coat pocket, staring through the open side of the structure toward the skyline beyond. The city stretched across the horizon in steel and glass softened by rain. For a moment, Elena considered pretending she had not seen him. Instead, she changed direction and walked toward him. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly across the concrete floor. Sebastian turned before she spoke, almost as if he had sensed her approaching. His expression shifted slightly. "Did I?" The photograph. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. Not surprise, not exactly, more like resignation. The kind that comes when a person realizes a secret has taken its first step into daylight. Rain tapped gently against the metal railings nearby. Cars moved through distant streets below. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Sebastian looked back toward the skyline. "I suppose I did." Elena folded her arms. "Who is she?" He remained silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. "Someone important? Family?" Another pause. "Not mine." That answer only deepened the mystery. Elena watched him carefully. The closer she looked, the more exhausted he appeared, not physically, emotionally, like a man carrying something heavy for far too long. She looked familiar, Elena said quietly. Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Did she? Enough that it made me uncomfortable. The rain outside intensified. Water streaked across the open edges of the garage. Somewhere below, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the distance. Sebastian lowered his gaze toward the concrete floor. For the first time since meeting him, he seemed uncertain. Some people leave echoes behind, he said, even after they are gone. Elena frowned. Gone where? He looked at her then, directly. Sometimes that is the question nobody ever stops asking. The answer settled between them like fog. Elena did not understand it, but she felt its weight. She wanted to ask more. Instead, her attention shifted to something partially visible inside the open passenger door of his car. A worn manila folder rested on the seat. Several papers protruded from the top. One corner had slipped free, just enough to reveal part of an old photograph attached to a document. Elena's breath caught. It was the same woman again, only this image looked older, more formal. The edge of the photo appeared damaged, torn, missing a section. Before Elena could study it further, Sebastian quietly closed the passenger door. The folder disappeared from view. Neither acknowledged what had just happened. "You should get some sleep," Sebastian said. Elena almost laughed. "You keep saying that because you keep needing it." A reluctant smile appeared despite herself. The tension eased slightly. For a brief moment, they simply stood there, listening to the rain. Two strangers connected by questions neither seemed ready to answer. Then Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a second before placing it back inside. The movement seemed automatic, careful, protective, Elena noticed. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing important." She immediately knew he was lying, not because of his words, because of the way his eyes briefly darkened when he looked at the paper. Whatever it was mattered a great deal. Unfortunately for Elena, she had no idea that the name written across that folded page was the same name she had seen attached to the damaged photograph. And she certainly did not know that before the week ended, she would hear that name for the first time. Rose. Names have a strange of finding the people who were meant to hear them. Enna spent the next several days trying not to think about the name she had glimpsed on Sebastian's folded paper, Rose. It should have been meaningless. Thousands of women across America shared that name, yet every time it surfaced in her memory, something tugged gently at her attention. The feeling followed her through another stretch of long shifts and sleepless mornings. By the following Tuesday, St. Gabriel Medical Center was dealing with a wave of respiratory cases that left nearly every department understaffed. Elena moved from room to room with practiced efficiency, adjusting equipment, checking charts, and offering reassurance to anxious families. The hours blurred together beneath fluorescent lights and endless pages. Near midnight, she finally escaped to a quiet hallway near the hospital archives. Few employees ever came here. The narrow corridor connected several storage rooms filled with decades of medical records. It was one of the rare places in the building where silence still existed. Elena leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. That was when she heard voices. Not an argument, not even a conversation, just two people speaking quietly around the corner. One voice belonged to an older woman Elena recognized immediately, Martha Jensen, the archive supervisor. She had worked at St. Gabriel for more than 30 years. The second voice belonged to Sebastian. Elena froze before she could stop herself. "I checked the records you requested," Martha said softly. "Most of them were transferred years ago." "And the rest?" Sebastian asked. "Incomplete." Papers rustled. A filing drawer slid open somewhere nearby. Martha hesitated before speaking again. "You have been looking for this for a long time, have you not?" A long pause followed. "Yes," Sebastian answered. The single word carried enough weight to silence the hallway. Elena remained motionless. Curiosity rooted her to the spot. Martha sighed. "Sometimes old records stay buried for a reason. Sometimes they do not." Another pause. Then Martha's voice lowered. "The only name that appears consistently is Rose." Elena's heartbeat stumbled. Rose. The same name again. The same name attached to the damaged photograph. The same name hidden inside Sebastian's folded paper. She took a small step backward. Her shoe brushed lightly against the floor. The sound was barely audible, yet the conversation stopped instantly. Elena's stomach dropped. A second later, Sebastian appeared around the corner. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened the moment they landed on her. Neither spoke. The silence stretched. Finally, Elena lifted both hands slightly. "I was looking for a quiet place to drink coffee." Sebastian glanced toward the paper cup she was still holding. "And did you find one?" The question carried the faintest hint of amusement. Elena exhaled. The tension eased a little. Martha appeared behind him, carrying a folder against her chest. The older woman's eyes moved between them before she smiled politely and excused herself. Within seconds, she disappeared through a nearby doorway. Elena looked back toward Sebastian. "You spend a surprising amount of time in hospitals for someone who does not work in one. And you spend a surprising amount of time asking questions. Occupational hazard." That earned another brief smile. They began walking slowly down the corridor together. The hospital seemed quieter after midnight. The distant sounds of rolling carts and elevator chimes echoed faintly through the building. For a while, neither spoke. Then Elena finally asked the question that had been growing inside her for days. "Who is Rose?" Sebastian stopped walking, just for a second, long enough for Elena to notice. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected softly against the polished floor. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled beyond the city skyline. When Sebastian looked at her again, something had changed behind his eyes. Not fear, not anger, grief, deep and carefully controlled. "Someone important," he said quietly. Elena sighed. "That is the same answer you gave before. It is still the truth." She wanted to push harder. Instead, she found herself studying his face. Whatever story connected him to that name clearly hurt, more than he was willing to admit, more than she was ready to understand. They reached the end of the corridor where a large window overlooked the city. Rain streaked across the glass. Below, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Sebastian stood looking out at the skyline. Elena stood beside him. For the first time, neither seemed in a hurry to leave. Unfortunately for both of them, neither realized that somewhere inside the hospital archives sat a forgotten file containing a photograph Elena had not seen yet. A photograph taken 8 years earlier. A photograph showing a smiling young woman named Rose Bennett, a woman whose face looked almost exactly like Elena's. People notice absence far faster than presence. Elena did not realize how true that was until Sebastian stopped appearing. The first night passed without concern. Hospitals were full of interrupted routines and unexpected schedules. She assumed he was busy. The second night felt different. She found herself glancing toward the chapel doorway while pretending to read patient notes. Every time footsteps echoed through the hallway, part of her expected to see his dark coat appear. He never did. By the fourth night, the empty seat beside the stained glass window had become impossible to ignore. Elena hated that it bothered her. She barely knew him. They had shared a handful of conversations, a few cups of coffee, and more questions than answers, yet his absence lingered in the corners of her attention throughout every shift. The city moved deeper into spring. Rainstorms rolled across Manhattan almost daily. The hospital remained as busy as ever. Patients arrived. Patients left. Elevators opened and closed. Life continued, but something felt different. One evening, shortly after 11, Elena stepped into the chapel carrying a paper cup and found herself staring at the bench where he usually sat. The colored glass above cast soft pools of blue and gold across the floor. The room felt larger without him, quieter, lonelier. She shook her head at herself and turned to leave. "Looking for someone?" Elena glanced up. Father Michael, the hospital chaplain, stood near the doorway holding a stack of prayer cards. She immediately looked away. "No." The older man smiled knowingly. "Of course not." Elena groaned softly. "Is it that obvious? Only to people who spend their lives watching lonely people." That answer stayed with her longer than she expected. 3 days later, her shift finally ended before midnight. It felt almost unnatural. For the first time in weeks, she left the hospital while most of the city was still awake. Instead of driving straight home, she found herself taking a longer route through Riverside Park. The rain had stopped an hour earlier. Water still clung to tree branches and reflected the glow of street lamps. The Hudson River moved quietly beyond the walking path. Elena breathed deeply. The cool air felt different from the filtered air inside the hospital, cleaner somehow, more honest. She walked for nearly 20 minutes before noticing a small memorial area near the river. Fresh flowers rested beneath a stone marker surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping. Someone had visited recently. A candle still flickered inside a glass lantern despite the wind. Elena slowed, then stopped completely. A familiar black sedan sat parked nearby. Her pulse quickened. The vehicle was impossible to mistake. Before she could decide whether to continue walking, she spotted him. Sebastian stood alone several yards away facing the river. His hands rested inside his coat pockets. The city lights shimmered across the water behind him. For several moments she simply watched. He seemed unaware of everything around him. The traffic, the wind, the distant sounds of the city. He looked like a man carrying a conversation with someone who was no longer there to answer. Elena considered leaving. Something stopped her. She approached quietly until her footsteps finally drew his attention. Sebastian turned. Surprise flickered briefly across his face before disappearing. Elena! The sound of her name felt strangely familiar now. You vanished, she said before she could stop herself. A faint smile touched his lips. That sounds almost like concern. Do not get used to it. The smile lingered for a second, then faded. Elena's gaze drifted toward the memorial stone behind him. A bouquet of white lilies rested against the base, fresh, carefully arranged. Someone important? She asked softly. Sebastian looked toward the flowers. The silence that followed told her more than words could have. Wind stirred across the river. The lantern flame flickered. Yes, he finally said. Elena nodded. She did not press further. For once, questions felt unnecessary. They stood together facing the water. Two people listening to the city breathe around them. Then Elena noticed something carved into the lower corner of the memorial stone. Just a name. One word illuminated by the nearby lantern. Liam. Sebastian followed her gaze immediately. His expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Elena to understand that she had stumbled onto something deeply personal. Before she could ask who Liam was, Sebastian quietly looked away toward the river. Unfortunately for Elena, she had no idea that the name she had just seen belonged to the person at the center of every answer she had been searching for. Some truths arrive quietly, others wait until a single name changes everything. The wind coming off the Hudson carried the scent of rain and river water as Elena stood beside Sebastian near the memorial. The city glowed behind them in scattered reflections across the dark surface of the water. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence felt different now, more fragile. Elena looked again toward the flowers arranged beneath the stone marker, white lilies, freshly replaced. Someone cared enough to return often, someone who had not moved on. Liam was family. Elena glanced toward him. His eyes remained fixed on the river. Your brother? She asked softly. He nodded once. The answer explained more than she expected. The grief she had noticed, the late nights, the endless visits to quiet places where nobody asked questions. Elena understood loss, not necessarily his loss, but loss itself. There were certain wounds that never disappeared. They simply became part of the person carrying them. I am sorry, she said. Sebastian offered a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. Most people say that when they do not know what else to say, maybe because there is nothing else to say. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at her. Something softened in his expression, not happiness, recognition, as though she had answered a question he had never asked aloud. They remained near the memorial until the air grew colder. Eventually, Elena checked the time and realized nearly an hour had passed. It felt impossible. Conversations with Sebastian never seemed long while they were happening. Time behaved differently around him. As they walked back toward the parking area, Elena found herself studying him more carefully than before. The pieces never quite fit together, the quiet confidence, the sadness he carried like a shadow. Every answer seemed to create three new questions. Near the edge of the lot, Sebastian stopped. You should head home, Elena laughed softly. There it is again. What, you telling me to sleep? Someone has to. She shook her head. One of these days I am going to find out why you spend so much time worrying about a stranger. The words were meant as a joke. Sebastian's smile disappeared almost immediately. The reaction was subtle but impossible to miss. Elena felt her stomach tighten. For a second it looked like he might say something important. Instead, he glanced away. Good night, Elena. Before she could respond, he opened the driver's door and disappeared into the car. A moment later, the sedan pulled away and vanished into the city traffic. Elena stood there watching the taillights fade. Something about that conversation felt unfinished, like a sentence interrupted halfway through. 3 nights later, the answer arrived from a direction she never expected. Shortly after midnight, Martha Jensen appeared in the respiratory department carrying a stack of archive requests. The older woman looked exhausted. Please tell me you know how to operate this scanner, Martha said. The computer and I are no longer speaking. Elena laughed and followed her downstairs to the archive office. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding decades of medical history. Martha continued muttering about technology while searching for a missing file. Elena moved toward the scanner and began helping organize several folders stacked nearby. Most contained routine records. Nothing unusual. Then one folder slipped from the pile and landed open across the desk. A photograph slid partially free, blonde hair, gentle eyes, the same woman she had seen before, the same woman from Sebastian's photograph. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she picked up the image. Attached beneath it was a patient identification form dated 8 years earlier. The name printed across the top seemed to pull the air from her lungs. Rose Bennett. Elena stared at the words. Once, twice, certain she had read them wrong, but the letters remained unchanged. Rose Bennett's sister. The room suddenly felt too small, too bright, too loud. Martha looked up from across the office and immediately noticed her expression. "Oh dear," the older woman whispered. Elena's hands trembled slightly. "Why is my sister's picture in a hospital archive?" Martha's face drained of color. Outside the archive office, thunder rolled across Manhattan, and somewhere less than a mile away, Sebastian Moretti received a phone call that made him realize the secret he had protected for months was about to unravel. Some discoveries do not answer questions, they create entirely new ones. Elena remained frozen beside the archive desk long after Martha stopped speaking. The photograph trembled slightly in her hands. Rose Bennett, her sister. The name stared back at her from the patient file as though 8 years had suddenly collapsed into a single moment. Elena had spent years learning how to live around that loss. Years convincing herself there were no more surprises left hidden inside it. Martha slowly sat down across from her. The older woman looked deeply uncomfortable. "Elena," she said carefully, "I did not realize you were related. Neither did I." Elena swallowed hard. Her voice sounded distant even to herself. "Why is she here?" Martha hesitated. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Outside the archive office, the hospital continued moving through another busy night. Nurses pushed carts through hallways. Elevators opened and closed. Somewhere a telephone rang, yet inside the room everything felt strangely still. Elena lowered herself into a chair. Her eyes never left the photograph. Rose looked exactly as she remembered. Warm smile, bright eyes, the expression of someone who believed tomorrow would always arrive. The sight hurt more than Elena expected. "I thought all her records were transferred years ago," she whispered. Martha nodded. "Most were." "Most?" Another uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, Martha opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. Unlike the others, this one contained only a few pages. Several sections had been redacted, others were missing entirely. "This is all that remains here," Martha said. Elena reached for it immediately. The documents were old. Some pages had yellowed with age. She scanned line after line, searching for something that made sense. Instead, she found fragments, dates, medical references, administrative notes. None of them explained why Sebastian had spent months searching for information connected to her sister. None of them explained why he carried Rose's photograph everywhere he went. Then Elena noticed a handwritten note attached near the back. The paper was faded. The ink remained visible. One sent notification pending. Her pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Martha leaned closer. "I am not sure." Elena looked up sharply. "You worked here, not in this department back then." Martha sighed. Whatever happened involved another section of the hospital. Those records were archived separately years ago. Elena closed the folder. Her thoughts raced. Every conversation with Sebastian suddenly felt different. Every strange coincidence, every unanswered question, the chapel, the coffee, the photograph, Rose, none of it could be accidental. Before she could speak again, her phone vibrated. A message notification appeared on the screen. Unknown number. Elena stared at it. She rarely received messages from unknown contacts. Slowly, she opened it. 3 words appeared. "We need to talk." No signature, no explanation. Yet she already knew who sent it. Less than 20 minutes later, Elena stepped onto the rooftop observation deck above the hospital. The rain had finally stopped. Clouds drifted across the night sky while the city stretched endlessly beyond the railings. Lights shimmered in every direction. Sebastian stood near the far edge overlooking Manhattan. His coat moved slightly in the wind. For a moment, neither spoke. Elena approached until only a few feet separated them. Sebastian closed his eyes for a brief second. Yes, the answer landed harder than she expected, not because she doubted it, because hearing it confirmed everything. "How long?" "Since before we met." Elena looked away toward the city. The skyline blurred slightly. She was not angry, not exactly, confused, hurt, curious, all at once. "Why did you not tell me?" Sebastian remained silent. The wind carried distant traffic sounds upward from the streets below. Finally he spoke. "Because I did not know how." Elena laughed softly. There was no humor in it. "That is not a real answer. It is the only honest one I have." She turned toward him. For the first time, Sebastian looked uncertain. The confidence she usually associated with him seemed gone. In its place stood a man carrying years of unfinished grief. "Tell me about Rose," Elena said. Sebastian looked out across the city lights. His jaw tightened. His voice was almost lost beneath the wind. "I cannot explain Rose without telling you about Liam." Elena felt her heartbeat quicken. The two names, the two mysteries, suddenly connected. And for the first time, she realized they might have been connected all along. The city seemed impossibly quiet from the hospital rooftop. Wind drifted across the concrete surface while thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. Elena stood motionless, waiting. Somewhere below them, elevators moved between floors. Lives changed every minute inside St. Gabriel Medical Center. Up here, time felt suspended. Sebastian rested both hands against the railing and stared into the distance. For several seconds, he said nothing. Elena almost thought he had changed his mind. Then he finally spoke. "Liam was my younger brother." His voice remained calm, but the effort behind that calmness was impossible to miss. He was 6 years younger than me, smarter than me, kinder than me. Everybody liked him. Elena listened quietly. The wind tugged at her hair. "When we were younger, he had this habit of talking to strangers like they were already friends. Coffee shop cashiers, taxi drivers, people waiting in line. It drove me crazy." A faint smile appeared and disappeared, but somehow it always worked. Elena found herself smiling too. For the first time, Liam felt less like a mystery and more like a real person. Someone who had existed beyond the memorial flowers and unanswered questions. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Years ago, Liam became very sick." Elena immediately understood the weight hidden behind the simple words. Hospitals taught people how much could fit inside a sentence. Hope, fear, waiting, long nights. Sebastian continued. There was a point when nobody knew if he would survive. His jaw tightened slightly. Everything depended on finding a donor. Elena felt her pulse quicken. The memory of the hospital files flashed through her mind. Rose, Liam, hospital records, missing documents. Suddenly the puzzle pieces seemed much closer together. "Did they find one?" she asked. Sebastian nodded slowly. "Yes." Another silence followed. Elena watched him carefully. Every instinct told her there was more, much more. Yet he seemed reluctant to continue, almost as though speaking the story aloud gave it power over him again. Finally he exhaled. Liam got a second chance. Elena glanced toward the city lights, and he recovered for a while. The answer landed heavily between them. Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on the skyline. Not once did he look at her. It was easier that way, easier to talk to the darkness than another human being. "For years I thought that second chance was a miracle," he said quietly. "Maybe it was." Elena folded her arms against the cold. Sebastian laughed softly. There was no humor in the sound. Miracles usually feel simpler than this. The rooftop door opened briefly behind them as a nurse stepped outside to answer a phone call. A few seconds later she disappeared again, leaving them alone. The interruption broke some of the tension. Elena looked toward Sebastian. "You spent months searching for records connected to Rose." He remained silent. "You carried her photograph." Still silence. "And somehow all of this connects back to Liam." This time Sebastian nodded. "Yes." Frustration flickered inside her. Not anger, just exhaustion. Every answer seemed to arrive wrapped inside another mystery. "Then help me understand." For the first time that evening, Sebastian turned fully toward her. His expression looked older than usual, the kind of weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. "I am trying." Elena studied him for a moment. Then something occurred to her. A possibility she had avoided because it seemed too strange, too unlikely. "Did Rose know Liam?" she asked. Sebastian's reaction was immediate, not dramatic, just a brief stillness, the kind that appears when someone accidentally steps close to the truth. Elena felt her heartbeat accelerate. "Sebastian." He looked away again. "I do not know." The answer surprised her. It sounded honest, completely honest. "You do not know?" "No." Wind swept across the rooftop. Clouds moved slowly above the city. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded photocopy from the archive files. The paper showed signs of age, creases, faded ink. He held it carefully before handing it to Elena. She unfolded it. Her breath caught immediately. At the bottom of the page sat a familiar signature, Rose Bennett. Above it were several medical authorization forms she had never seen before. Elena stared at the document, confused, shocked. The meaning remained just out of reach. Then her eyes drifted toward a section near the top where several lines had been blacked out years earlier. All except one. One sentence remained visible. One sentence that changed everything. Donor authorization approved. For a moment, Elena could not hear the wind. She could not hear the traffic below or the distant sounds of the hospital behind them. Her eyes remained fixed on the document, trembling slightly in her hands. Donor authorization approved. The words seemed impossible. Unreal. Rose had never spoken about anything like this. Not to Elena. Not to anyone she knew. 8 years of grief suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "What is this?" Elena whispered. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "The answer I was searching for. You knew?" "Not completely." He shook his head. "I suspected." The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes. "For months I found fragments. Names that appeared beside Liam's file and then disappeared again. Every trail eventually led back to Rose. Elena stared at him. "My sister was a donor." Sebastian nodded slowly. The rooftop seemed colder now. The night air pressed against her skin. Elena looked back at the document. Beneath the signature sat several medical references she did not fully understand. Yet one fact had become impossible to ignore. Rose had made a decision Elena never knew about. A decision that mattered to someone else. To another family, to another life. Sebastian stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough that she no longer felt alone beneath the vast night sky. "When Liam became sick, time started running out," he said quietly. "There were months when every phone call felt like a verdict. Every day brought another delay, another disappointment." His gaze drifted toward the skyline. Then one day the hospital called. Elena listened without moving. A match had been found. Sebastian swallowed once before continuing. "Liam survived because someone he never met chose to help a stranger." Elena felt tears gathering behind her eyes, not because of sadness alone, because suddenly Rose felt present again. Not as a memory, not as a photograph. As a person whose choices had continued long after she was gone. Sebastian looked down briefly before speaking again. For years, nobody knew who that person was. Confidentiality laws protected everyone involved. His voice softened. "Liam always wanted to know." Elena blinked. "What do you mean?" A faint smile touched Sebastian's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all night. Every birthday he would raise a glass and thank someone he had never met. Elena felt her chest tighten. She could almost picture it. A young man celebrating another year of life because a stranger had once said yes. He used to call them his invisible hero. The words broke something open inside her. She looked away toward the city lights. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. This time she did not hide them. There was no point. Sebastian remained beside her in silence. No empty reassurance, no attempt to fix what could not be fixed. Just presence. Sometimes that mattered more. Several minutes passed before Elena finally spoke. "Rose never told me." Her voice shook slightly. "Not once." Sebastian nodded. Maybe she did not think she needed recognition. Elena laughed softly through the tears. "That sounds exactly like her." The wind moved across the rooftop again. Above them, clouds slowly parted, revealing a handful of stars scattered across the dark sky. For the first time in years, Elena felt as though she had learned something new about her sister, something beautiful, something unexpected. Yet another question remained. If Liam survived, why were you visiting that memorial? The smile disappeared from his face immediately. The silence that followed answered part of the question before he ever spoke. His eyes lowered toward the concrete floor. When he finally looked up again, grief stood plainly behind them, raw, unhidden. "Because 6 months ago," he said quietly. "I lost him anyway." The words struck with the weight of a falling stone. Elena stopped breathing for a second. Sebastian looked away toward the city once more. "And that is the part of the story I never wanted you to hear." The wind seemed colder after those words. Elena stood beside Sebastian beneath the open night sky, staring at him as the meaning slowly settled into place. For years, Rose had been gone. Now she had learned that her sister's final act had given another family hope. And now she was learning that hope had eventually ended in loss anyway. The cruelty of it felt impossible to process. Neither spoke for several moments. The city lights shimmered beyond the rooftop railings like distant stars. Somewhere below, an ambulance siren echoed through the streets before fading into the darkness. Life continued. It always did, even when people wished it would stop for a moment and allow them to catch their breath. Sebastian rested his forearms against the railing. His eyes never left the skyline. Liam was 28, he said quietly. He had plans for everything. He made lists for vacations he had not taken yet. Restaurants he wanted to try, places he wanted to see. A faint smile touched his face. He once spent 3 months planning a road trip that never happened because he changed the route every week. Elena listened without interrupting. She understood now that this was not merely a story. It was a memory, a living thing. After everything he survived, he believed he had to make every day count. Sebastian continued, not because he was afraid of losing time, because he appreciated having it. The words hung in the air about Rose, about the choices people made without realizing how far the consequences would travel. One decision, one signature, one act of kindness. 8 years later, 2 strangers stood on a hospital rooftop because of it. Sebastian exhaled slowly. When Liam died, people kept telling me the same thing. His voice hardened slightly. They told me to be grateful for the extra years. Elena looked at him. And were you? A bitter laugh escaped him. The honesty in that answer hurt more than anger ever could. But grief does not care about gratitude. It takes what it wants anyway. Elena lowered her gaze. She knew that feeling. After Rose died, people had filled every silence with advice. They had spoken about healing and closure and moving forward. None of it helped. Loss had its own schedule, its own language. Sometimes survival meant carrying the absence rather than escaping it. For the first time since arriving on the rooftop, Elena stepped closer, not dramatically, just enough that the distance between them felt smaller. You do not have to explain it to me, she said softly. Sebastian turned toward her. The city reflected faintly in his eyes. No, he replied. I think you are one of the few people who actually understand it. The words settled somewhere deep inside her, not because they were romantic, not because they were dramatic, because they were true. The connection between them no longer felt accidental, it felt earned, built from shared silences and old scars rather than grand declarations. The rooftop door opened behind them. A gust of warm air escaped from the stairwell before the door closed again. Neither moved. Elena studied Sebastian for a moment before speaking. Is that why you started looking for Rose? He nodded. After Liam was gone, I found some of his old journals. His voice softened. He still wrote about the donor, even years later. Elena blinked. He never stopped thinking about her? Never. Sebastian smiled faintly. He believed every extra day mattered because someone chose to give it to him. The tears returned unexpectedly. Elena looked away toward the city. For years she had carried grief for her sister. Tonight she discovered another person had carried gratitude for her. The realization felt overwhelming, beautiful, heartbreaking, all at once. Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded photograph. Carefully he handed it to her. Elena recognized it immediately. The same picture she had seen before. Rose standing beside a lake beneath bright summer sunlight. This time she noticed something she had missed. Another person stood at the edge of the frame. The image had been torn. Part of the photograph was missing. Someone had deliberately removed the second figure years ago. Elena looked up. Who was standing next to her? For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed Sebastian's face. He glanced toward the photograph before answering. That is what I have been trying to find out. Beneath the rooftop lights, Elena turned the photograph over. A faded handwritten date appeared on the back, and beneath the date sat a location she recognized immediately, St. Gabriel Medical Center. The date on the back of the photograph refused to leave Elena's mind. 3 days passed, yet every time she closed her eyes she saw the faded handwriting. St. Gabriel Medical Center, the same hospital where she now worked, the same hospital where she had met Sebastian. The same hospital where her sister's story seemed to have left invisible fingerprints years before either of them understood why. Late Friday evening, Elena returned to the chapel. The stained glass windows glowed softly beneath the city lights outside. Rain tapped gently against the glass. The room was empty except for one familiar figure seated near the front. Sebastian sat with his hands folded loosely, staring toward the altar. He did not appear surprised when Elena entered. Somehow he never did. She crossed the room quietly and sat beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable now, earned. The kind of silence that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every empty space with words. The chapel candles flickered softly. Shadows danced across the wooden benches. Finally, Elena held out the photograph. I found something. Sebastian looked down at the image, the hospital date. He nodded slowly. I noticed it years ago. And it never led anywhere. Elena turned the photograph over again. Her thumb brushed against the faded ink. Maybe we were looking at it the wrong way. Sebastian studied her. What do you mean? Elena took a breath. Everyone keeps focusing on what happened after Rose died. Her voice remained quiet. What if the answer is before that? For the first time in days, genuine curiosity appeared in Sebastian's eyes. Elena continued, Rose volunteered here during college. Sebastian sat up slightly. How do you know that? I found an old yearbook while cleaning my apartment yesterday. A small smile touched her lips. She used to spend weekends helping patients find their rooms. She loved hospitals. Sebastian stared at her. Something shifted behind his expression. A memory, a possibility. Then slowly, almost cautiously, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. Elena recognized it immediately. The same document he had carried for months. The one connected to Rose. This time he handed it to her without hesitation. Elena unfolded it carefully. Near the bottom sat a small administrative signature she had ignored before. Not Rose's signature, another one. A volunteer coordinator. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Orientation completed. Pediatric wing assigned. Elena's breath caught. Sebastian saw it too. He said quietly. Elena looked up. Neither needed to say the rest aloud. Liam had spent part of his treatment there. The realization settled over both of them. Not as a mystery, as something gentler, something sadder. They may have crossed paths, Elena whispered. Sebastian looked toward the stained glass window. Rainwater traced silver paths down the glass. Maybe. The answer carried no certainty, only possibility. Yet somehow that possibility felt enough. They sat in silence for several moments. There is something I never understood. Sebastian met her gaze. What? Her voice softened. Why did you keep coming here? The question lingered between them. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city. Sebastian looked down at his hands. For the first time since she had known him, he seemed completely unguarded. No distance, no careful avoidance, just honesty. Because I stopped knowing how to pray. Elena blinked. The answer surprised her. Sebastian smiled faintly at her expression. After Liam died, people expected me to move forward. His gaze drifted toward the altar. I could not. The candles reflected softly in his eyes. I came here every week because it was the only place where nobody expected anything from me. Elena listened without interrupting. Then one night, he continued, I walked into this chapel and found someone asleep on a bench. A small laugh escaped her despite herself. Sebastian smiled. You look completely exhausted. I was, I know. His voice softened. And for the first time in months, I saw someone carrying pain that looked familiar. The room fell silent again. Elena felt her chest tighten, not from sadness. Everything finally made sense. Not the mystery that had already been solved. This, the reason he stayed, the reason he kept returning, the reason neither of them had walked away. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. You reminded me that grief was not something I had to survive alone. The confession settled gently into the quiet chapel. No grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just truth. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. And through the stained glass window, the first faint hint of dawn started to appear. 3 months later, spring had finally surrendered to summer. The trees surrounding St. Gabriel Medical Center were full again, their leaves bright beneath the morning sun. The city felt different too, more alive. Elena stepped through the hospital entrance carrying a coffee cup and a folder tucked beneath one arm. For the first time in years, she had reduced her schedule. Fewer overnight shifts, more sleep. More life outside the hospital walls. It had not happened all at once. Healing rarely did, but little by little she had stopped measuring every day by what she had lost. The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. As the car climbed toward the upper floors, she caught her reflection in the polished metal walls. Something had changed, not dramatically, yet she could see it. The constant exhaustion that once lived behind her eyes had softened. The loneliness she carried for years no longer felt quite so heavy. When the doors opened again, Sebastian was waiting in the hallway. Elena smiled immediately. He smiled back. It still surprised her how natural that felt. Neither of them had planned any of this. They had met through grief, through silence, through two names connected by a choice made years before either of them understood its importance. Yet somehow those broken pieces had become the foundation of something neither expected to find. They walked together toward the chapel. It had become a habit. Every Friday minutes before the day began. No schedules, no obligations, just a pause, a reminder. The chapel looked exactly the same as it always had. Colored glass, wooden benches, soft morning light filtering through the windows. Yet it felt entirely different now. The room no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. The mystery was gone. The searching was over. Rose's story had been found. Liam's story had been honored. The past no longer felt unfinished. Elena sat on the same bench where everything had begun months earlier. Sebastian sat beside her. Outside, sunlight golden patterns across the stained glass windows. For several moments neither spoke. They simply listened to the quiet. The sound of distant footsteps in the hallway, the faint hum of the building, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing around them. Finally, Elena looked toward him. "Do you ever think they would have liked each other?" Sebastian smiled softly. He did not need to ask who she meant. "Rose and Liam?" Elena nodded. He considered the question for a moment. "I think Liam would have talked her ear off," Elena laughed. The sound echoed gently through the chapel. "That sounds accurate." Sebastian's smile widened. "And I think Rose would have pretended to be annoyed while secretly enjoying every minute of it." The laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Neither could know whether the answer was true. It did not matter. Some questions no longer needed certainty. The peace came from asking them together. Sebastian raised an eyebrow immediately. "That expression means trouble." "Possibly." He removed a small velvet box and rested it between them on the bench. For a second, neither moved. The morning light spilled across the dark fabric. Elena stared at it, then at him, then back at the box. Her heart forgot how to beat properly. Sebastian laughed softly at her expression. "That is the first time I have ever managed to surprise you." Elena opened her mouth, closed it again, then shook her head. "I hate you a little right now, that is fair." He became serious again. The warmth never left his eyes. "For a long time I thought loving someone meant losing them." His voice remained quiet, honest. "Then I met someone who kept showing up." Elena felt tears gathering immediately. Sebastian continued, "Someone who reminded me that staying is a choice." The chapel seemed impossibly still. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows behind them. Colors danced across the floor. "I cannot promise life will always be easy," Sebastian said, "but I can promise I will be there for it." Elena looked at him for several seconds before answering. The tears finally escaped. This time she did not bother hiding them. "That is good," she whispered, "because I was planning to stay too." Much later, after the laughter and tears and promises, they remained seated together on the same wooden bench. The chapel doors stayed closed. The city continued moving outside. Morning sunlight filled the room. Elena rested her head gently against Sebastian's shoulder. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Months earlier she had fallen asleep here alone beneath stained glass and silence. Now she sat in the same place beside someone who had chosen to stay, and for the first time in a very long time neither of them felt alone.